Hi, I'm Andrew Sears, and in this lecture, I'm going to talk about how to write a theological vision for your organization or ministry. Now, just the framework, this is a lecture that's in a larger course. We have a free YouTube playlist for it if you're just viewing this on YouTube, but the idea throughout this course is, we introduced theological vision. We talked about there's this secularization pattern that happened. Most of the course, though, has been around building the competencies that are needed to actually develop a theological vision. And the idea is that you need to have a good balance of competencies between all four quadrants of the Wesleyan quadrilateral: tradition, scripture, experience, reason. And in each week, you've been doing exercises to help build your competency in that. Building your competency in those domains is a lifelong commitment. But the idea now is that as you've built your competencies, you have a good grid for this. We had you think about your theological vision early in the course, but we don't want you to focus on what was there. We want you to do a deep dive on the theological vision for this week to develop a theological vision. And in next week, you're going to be developing a plan on how do you operationalize that to avoid mission drift. Now, one of the main frameworks through this course, and even the term theological vision, we're borrowing from Tim Keller's Centered Church book, and he talks about the difference between core theology that doesn't change, and then theological vision, that you use the tools of practical theology, and that's really what we're using the Wesleyan quadrilateral as a way to do that, to develop this thing that we're calling theological vision. And he articulates that as a faithful reinstatement of the gospel with rich implications for life, ministry, and mission in a particular culture at a moment of history. Now, some of the things that I've added is that's an extended version of your mission, vision, and values. You're articulating what is your unique ministry DNA, what's your philosophy of ministry, what's your theory of change, and what in particular, what's your priorities and emphases. And then that should define your ministry expression. And, that's how the gospel is expressed in a particular ministry at one community at a point of time. And there's 4 components that we are using for this: programs, culture and staff, systems and policies, and funding model. That's part of ministry expression. And then the strategic alignment model that we use throughout the course is this. And the idea is that theological vision should be driving these other components rather than the other way around. Because what often happens is, and if you just study psychology or you study the Bible, usually the way things work is we don't mess up because we think, you know what, I want to mess up, I want to sin. We mess up because we start to do things. It's the what we do. And then that starts to change how we see, and then that starts to change how we believe. And that's what we're trying to do. To avoid that is being overly pragmatic can reverse the order. That, you're just trying to get your ministry to grow, to be as functional as possible. But if you're not emphasizing and continuing to grow and thinking about how do you sharpen your vision, often the pragmatics can take over. So you take some funding that helps you grow, or you hire people that are competent, that aren't values aligned, and then that starts to change how you see. And then next thing you know, you're the YMCA. And usually those changes, the YMCA didn't shift in 10 years. It shifted over a couple generations. So for this, we've created a theological vision workbook. You can see the short URL here if you want it. It's available for free. If you're in the course, you'll have a link to this in our course. And this is a tool that you can use to create your own theological vision. So what you're trying to do with this tool, so as you learn, a lot of the learning is analysis and evaluation, but at the end, what you're trying to do is create a synthesis. So it's putting all the ingredients together to make something great. So that's what you're trying to do. So what you're trying to do is to combine tradition and history. So, thinking about the trend analysis. So what's unique about this place in history that requires adapting? So these are the questions you're asking the audience. Demographically, what groups are not being served as effectively and why? Often the demographics of who you're serving has changed. Tradition, what's your unique role given the tradition and culture you came from? And how do you avoid the trend towards secularization? So these are key questions you're asking on experience. The business model, how do you develop a business model that ensures continued financial growth? A lot of times people have great vision, but at the end of the day, if you can't grow, then you're going to be stuck. Which sometimes, you aren't called to grow, but I think that as a kingdom, I think God's kingdom is ever expanding. So somewhere, God is calling people to grow. How do the unique gifts of your leadership intersect with the needs of your current context? And then reason, it's thought leadership. How might your organization need to adapt to have the core competencies to apply the latest best practices from related fields, science, social sciences, counseling, et cetera, that fit your mission and values? Demographically, what groups are not being served as effectively as they could be and why? And then scripture, you have theological leadership. So how do you update your theological vision in a way that stays true to the scriptures, your theological tradition, systematic and biblical theology, and statement of faith? So that's what you're trying to do in your theological vision, is to combine all these different quadrants. So then there's a question of, what does a good organizational theological vision do? It's rooted in solid biblical foundation, core theology, your tradition and history. It identifies your unique call in addressing the problems you're working to solve. It inspires your community towards ministry. The last week we talked about one of the core competencies of a leader is to be an inspiring visionary. So you want to align their hearts, minds, and spirit. And you have to align different components, different stakeholders, your funders, your board, your staff, your volunteers, and be able to articulate that. Defines the mission, vision, and values of the ministry, repeated in common themes in training and teaching. Sets boundaries and distinctives for what the ministry will and will not do. So that's policies, procedures, and programs. Fits those you serve in your context, bringing growth in life. Describes a theory of change specific to your context. Connects with the larger movement of what God's doing in similar contexts. Adapts to the changes in your community of what God's doing. Protects against secularization and mission drift. And one of the hardest parts of this, and this is actually one of the biggest tests, is, can it be operationalized by tying specific values and strategies and procedures? And most recently, I've been, tweaking our value statements to make it so that we can better operationalize some of the values. And I think that that's something that's important, because a lot of times what I see is people have value statements that look more like brochures, but if you ask them, okay, tell me 50 ways that you've operationalized. And honestly, most organizations should be able to have 50 ways you've operationalized those values. Most people just draw a blank on that. So there's kind of a question of, why invest so much effort into developing a theological vision, and why not just leave our current mission, vision, and value statement as it is? Well, one big reason is to strengthen the foundation and ties to scripture and theology. So most mission, vision, values discussions happen in the business or experience or pragmatism framework, and that deprioritize the other quadrants of the Wesleyan quadrilateral in ways that cause mission drift. So this effort, by focusing, and the reason why I'm using this term theological vision, is it kind of forces you into a theological framing. So you're not just saying, oh, theological vision is the exact same thing as mission, vision, and values. Because if you do that, you're kind of still stuck in the business experience and pragmatism framework. The second reason is, most ministry value statements are not able to be effectively operationalized. So this often results in excellent espoused values. You have a great brochure, you got a great value statement on your website, but limited mechanisms for ensuring they're aligned with enacted values. The third is where you decide to innovate and contextualize to adapt to changes, and where you hold firm and not change will be among the most important decisions you will ever make in your ministry. So, a part of this, it's the process of doing this is going to help you grow in your competencies. So getting this right, in wrestling with this effort yourself and with other stakeholders, will help you develop a more vibrant culture of, deep experience across all four quadrants of the Wesleyan quadrilateral, and create a healthy a healthy dialogue and tension between them, because part of how you get to God's truth, it'd be easy if we could just say, okay, here's all the rules, just follow them like we're robots or computer code. But, discerning what God's saying, it's difficult, at times to discern, and it can be helpful to have a multitude. Wisdom is in a multitude of counselors, and part of it is getting the right counselors at the table that represent all four quadrants of the Wesleyan quadrilateral, and then having healthy dialogue and tension between them. The other thing is having extended mission, vision, and value statements can be very helpful to increase values alignment of especially senior leadership in programs. So a lot of times where I see organizations get off is they need their senior leadership to be at the highest levels of competency given the complexities and the size of the organization. And then they don't look at the collective competencies of the senior leadership team, and they get off in terms of their culture. So most public statements don't have enough detail to delineate all boundaries. So part of what I'm saying here is that Jesus with his disciples often had the public parable, but then he would go and explain in more detail to the disciples. And it can be helpful to have a public version of your mission, vision, and values that, is a page or two. But then you might have a 20-page, version, or maybe not that long, but a 5-page version of, your mission, vision, and values that are consistent with what you're saying publicly. You don't want inconsistencies, because Jesus was never inconsistent on his parables. It was just his parables were often more big picture or more general, and he would explain more of the details. And a lot of times it can be problematic to, put the details of every detail of how you manage your religious hiring rights in your organization, because the public just isn't going to understand that, and that's going to open you up for attack. So that's some of the reasons why it can be helpful to do a deep dive. Now, as you write this, if you're writing it in a course, obviously, if you want to make real changes in this, you're going to want to involve a lot more stakeholders. You're not going to have time to do that for this assignment, but over time, I would encourage you to, process this with a lot of your stakeholders, and you can use some of the videos from this course for that. So what are some of the components that should go into this? So what is your core theology? So, statement of faith, any affiliation with denomination or larger movement, and everyone is affiliated with a larger movement. So even if it's not clear, we're all a part of God's, kingdom. So there's a larger movement that we're connected with. So where do you fall on the theologically conservative versus liberal? Not to be confused with, political conservatism or liberalism. Where do you fit in the typology of faith-based organizations? And you can view my video on that typology. What are the most commonly quoted Bible passages related to the purpose of your ministry? What's the theological history and church or parachurch history related to the organization? How's the organization's mission shaped by those questions? Ultimately, what you're trying to do, going back to that theological vision diagram, how does your core theology inform your theological vision? So you need to say, okay, here is the core theology. Now, I want to talk about the typology of faith-based organizations, because this can have some pretty big implications. So a lot of it is you have to figure out where are you as an organization in terms of this typology. Because that's going to have big implications on your theological vision and ministry expression. So if you are, and there's a lot of ministries that may have started in most traditional and then now are adapting to traditional, or are traditional and adapting to critical mass. If that's what you're doing, you need to, one, be clear about that, and two, you have to have some intentional strategies to offset that so you don't secularize, as I've talked about. But which category you're in has big implications on your theological vision and ministry expression. The strategies of a critical mass faith-based organization are radically different than the most traditional, and your theological vision should not be the same between these, because they have very different approaches, and that needs to be articulated. Um, so, um, you know, other components in forming theological vision. So, um, we kind of already covered a lot of those things. But one of the things I want to talk about is one function of theology is to set boundaries of your organization. So, as I mentioned before, this quote I love: the endemic disagreements between liberal progressives and conservative traditionalists are arguments about how wide the boundaries of the tradition are. Um, since no rule can decide in advance about all change or all boundaries, a healthy tradition includes an ongoing argument around where the boundaries of the tradition are and whether they should change. The name for this ongoing argument in the Christian tradition is theology. I would like to say that's theology and also practical theology. So a big part of what I'm saying is how wide your boundaries are. This one is going to have more narrow and more firm boundaries. These are going to have more flexible boundaries, very wide boundaries. So now, the last thing I want to talk about is the relationship of this to organizational culture. So if you take a course on organizational culture, often in doctoral programs in leadership, this will be one of the main books. So Edgar Schein is basically like the guru on organizational culture. So his book is in the 5th edition. It's been read by probably hundreds of thousands of doctoral students. And he defines organizational culture as the culture of a group, can be defined as the accumulated shared learning of that group as it solves its problems of external adaptation. So that means your environment's changing, or you're in an environment and you're trying to adapt to that environment, and internal integration. So in many ways, that's, how does that align with your mission, vision, and values? And then he has an extended part, which I'll go into, which has worked well enough to be considered valid and therefore to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel and behave in relation to those problems. This accumulated learning is a pattern or systems of belief, values, and behavioral norms that come to be taken for granted as basic assumptions and eventually drop out of awareness. Now, this last part, the eventually drop out of awareness, is one of the most significant concerns that I have. In most organizations, they don't understand why they do what they do, and they don't understand how the whole system works together. So, as I mentioned before, an organization is a complicated system. Actually, a complex system, but it's a complicated system like a car. And if you don't understand how the components of a car work, you can't just take out the alternator and expect everything to still work. You have to understand how everything fits together. So for you as an organization leader, if you're going to change the system, you can't be like the average person. You can't have this basic assumptions that drop out of awareness. You have to get them back into your awareness. And that's a lot of what this course is about, is how do you get to that level of awareness? Because otherwise you're going to be changing things in ways that are either going to break the system or secularize the organization. So one of the other things that Edgar Schein uses often is this diagram that he says you have the espoused values. So that's kind of, up in the sky. And then you have what he calls cultural artifacts, which, for, you can see these lilies here that are showing up, but then you have these deeper roots that are the tactic cultural assumptions. So your theological vision is your espoused values. So that's what I'm calling the extended mission, vision, and value statement, rooted in 4 quadrants of the Wesleyan quadrilateral. Then you have cultural artifacts. So what that is that's all these components in your overall strategy. That's hiring strategy, staff, and evaluations. It's your training resources that you use, your program design, other processes, and it's how we do things. And in many ways, this is most of the ministry expression that we talk about. But then there's your deeper components of theological vision. So while this might be your public theological vision, a lot of this would be private. So what's our unique organizational call? What's unique about our time and place? What's at the root of the problem? Why are ministries that serve our audience not more effective? What practical theology do we need for our unique context, and what is our core theology? So the main point of these is that these things need to be synchronized. And that's really the big challenge, because what happens is that a lot of ministries have a lack of expertise in practical theology. They don't have, this high core competency across all four domains of the Wesleyan quadrilateral to be able to do that type of translation. And then they also have this disconnect between theological vision and ministry expression. So ultimately, many of the challenges faced by ministries are due to a lack of strategic alignment with these enacted values, with the espoused values. So ultimately, with this course, whereas this week is focused on developing a theological vision, next week's going to be focused on a plan to operationalize your values to avoid mission drift, to make sure that you have that alignment. So hopefully all this is helpful for you. Thanks a lot.